Hello everyone, today we talk about Charlemagne's coronation of 800, looking at the sources on the event quite briefly and criticizing them a little in historiographical perspective. So we already made a video about the coronation in itself, about Charlemagne and about the Carolingian Empire and so on, so for any curiosity you can check the dedicated playlists. It's important to talk about this event in a historiographical perspective because about the same at the time we really don't have an enormous say documentation, which doesn't mean that it's abnormal in terms like this event was hidden or something at all, but let's say it's actually normal for the time to have had just this relatively few sources that explain us in detail, or at least also with a bit of criticism, what it is. But it's rather relevant that these sources, say, differ by some degree. And the point of the video is not to be fooled about the meaning of this all, right? It's very easy in a contemplative sense to look at history and say, well, there are different opinions. So who knows what's the truth behind that, right? It's all more complex than it seems. Yeah, everything is always more complex than it seems, but that complexity actually has to do with a much wider range of issues that we know about the rest of history at that time, and not necessarily some accounts that describe something which can be easily interpreted on, in fact, what you should hopefully have as a historical base on the topic and the context of power ratios, for example, at the time, which is something that especially the neophyte historian very hardly can have in perspective, and that's what I think most of our education fails nowadays, that it doesn't get you the basics right. And even when I say these things, the average layman thinks that because he knows what the right bases are, because it's that ideology that I wink at, right? Wink, wink. No, it's not about that, right? That still probably means that you have no idea what we're talking about. Getting the basics right is simply, studying the basics as they are provided historiographically with a certain degree of accuracy altogether by lots of simple manuals. I give you that manuals are not always well written at all, right? Unfortunately, and especially in certain environments. But let's say the 20th century has produced actually pretty good and insightful manualistics that is, fakely read, not even studied in the first medieval history exams at this, pitiful kind of tertiary education level that we still pretend has some value consistently, and forgotten in the rest of the path that is basically about hyper-specialization and therefore driving away for an ever more kind of comprehensive perspective on the single events and not just being in the box of that specific event. That's the reason why this video, I make these premises because I'd like to shock you a bit, to wake you up a bit about certain things, because this channel shouldn't be about flattering yourself. On the contrary, and given that it does go in some depth, at least remaining limited to these several sources we're reading, also pretty famous ones, should make us understand, in fact, that there is a broader view that should have already matured, hopefully even just as a medievalist. The first one that we read is the 799 minuted opinion on recent events internationally, sent by Alcuin of York to Charlemagne. Recently I just made a video about the Carolingian court, like the base of a shared European tradition. We have looked at Heinhard, Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, etc. especially in the recovery of the classics, but not only. This is important because Alcuin, as you will see, makes a classical reference and intertwining it with the current events. In fact, in his message, he describes how Pope Leo III had fallen victim to a conspiracy in Rome, which was actually pretty frequent at the time. The same Franks had often and were keeping to play in that game, given that there was at this point always kind of a pro or anti-Frankish faction. This is, as you know, well after that the Italic kingdom had been conquered by the Carolingians, but with the incipient papal states essentially already having a large degree of autonomy, and the Franks being quite careful in handling the matters with the same papacy that was providing them with this international legitimization even before, this is the year before the coronation, that were probably some machinations were already in motion for the imperial coronation, in fact. But importantly enough to provide an instability that could legitimize the same Carolingians to step in and to arrange the situation in a more, in fact, direct fashion. Pope Leo III had fled to the same protection of Charlemagne at Paderborn in Saxony. These were newly conquered lands, and quite symbolically, also showing the what would become de facto, and what already was, as we will see at some point, traditionally the imperial power and the papal one over the pagan peoples of Europe. Secondly, Alcuin describes the Byzantine emperor Constantine the Sixth and how he had been deposed and blinded by his own mother in 797. He will be killed eventually. So these are the tender-hearted, familiar relations that the Byzantine court, the refined Byzantine court, had. Not even the Merovingians went as far as killing family members that viciously, to tell it all. But there is always a logic behind that. It's just a pretty messed up one. In any case, as Alcuin remarked, as you know, at this point it was in fact the Empress Irene that de facto ruled the empire, even though she couldn't be an empress because there cannot be anything like a female emperor, right? For reasons that we'll also explain now, that we'll probably deepen at some point. And this went on, right? Consider not even Maria Theresa in the 18th century was the actual Kaiserin, even if she was called like that, because it was just tradition forbade it. It was her husband, right? So as Alcuin remarked, quote, "The news has spread everywhere of the impious manner in which the head of this empire," talking about Constantinople, "has been deposed." So Alcuin, at this point, so setting the stage for this dramatic picture where the two Romes are, in pretty dreadful straits, puts in this version of the mantle of heaven falling upon the same Charlemagne in such circumstance. Quote, "Thirdly, there is the sovereign status which our Lord Jesus Christ has reserved to you in order that you may govern all Christian peoples. This status is higher than the two others, eclipses them in wisdom, and surpasses them in power. It is now on thee alone that the churches of Christ depend. From thee alone they await their salvation from the avenger of crimes." This is a beautiful piece of actual traditional ideology in Christian souls, naturally, that speaks, as the universal tradition does always, the idea of wisdom and power associated. It's the idea of the verbum. It's the idea properly of wisdom in the of knowledge in the ancient tradition. The barbarians are the fools, the stupid, the big, strong ones that cannot use their brain, right? The hero, right? The Indo-European hero and all European tradition is the smart guy that manages to, essentially to make himself divine through the transcendence of the same human limits that derive from the awareness of his role in the world, where the others forget it, right? Like in the Twilight of the Gods. That brings, in fact, to the storming of the Asgard. And in fact, Rome had been fled by the papacy. In Constantinople, the same emperor had been taken out. What is very interesting about what Alcuin writes is how he stresses the plurality of Christ's churches, right? Because, of course, there were different churches in the sense that the church was administered in different ways, but this reference, especially after the Roman and the Constantinopolitan examples, means the obvious, that is to say that Charlemagne here had to take on the role of ecumenic ruler, which was even kind of negotiated. As you know, Charlemagne at some point thought also of marrying Irene, and so to reunite East and West and all these things. It was a very concrete idea. And what is fascinating about Alcuin as well is that an Anglo-Saxon with specific, or a very high, cultural level, but definitely and possibly one of the most educated known person of his times in Western Europe, was essentially fully aware, and this is the beauty of, we're talking about it in that video about the recovery of the classics as European tradition, perfectly aware of what the role of an emperor was, right? And what now, properly from an individual point of view, in a political and military sense, Charlemagne's mission was, right? So I've seen Alcuin being often also kind of the author of friendship, of love, of joyful or playfulness in a sense. And he talks about such a serious task as the immediate interests of the empire were evidenced by the international situation. And because of this ecumenic scale, let's say, the previous powers, so including in theory the papacy in the same Byzantine Empire, are surpassed, right? Because this status conferred by an ecumenic rule that Charlemagne should have access by stepping in all of the system would have, of course, been the world domination, which is, at the end of the day, what any power was seeking at the time, in a much more obvious and way, the way we should all do in practice, even though, in fact, achieving it, that is, if you're not capable, just don't even try, because that's exactly what the level in which you're going to remain at, and that's why, today there is factually no power that can achieve that, even the largest one, being, in fact, not the case, but, even less the other ones. So there is such a ridiculous departure from these beliefs nowadays that I don't even know whether it's actually a comical thing or not. It's actually a tragedy in many ways. So, according to Alcuin, Charlemagne's Christ-given authority outstripped the same powers of the papacy and the court of Constantinople, right? And in many ways was, in fact, even beyond the resumption of a Western imperial title. This is, as you know, with my video about the Eastern Roman issue, etc., there was no such thing in the titling of the time. There was no such thing in the ideology of the time, because in the moment in which you limit the imperium, which is the God-given one, it's not the ecumenic rule anymore. This was about taking over the world. Mm-hmm. And the year before this, Alcuin had, in any case, referred to a superior imperium Christianum, committed by God to Charlemagne and his sons to govern. This is interesting because it stresses, in a very Frankish way, the dynastic nature of power, that since the Merovingians had basically affirmed itself in a unique fashion that not even, the late Roman imperial power had substantiated itself in. So this was an obvious signal to Charlemagne that the Frankish realm and the Danielic so-called last empire were one and the same thing. And the latter hinted specifically at another aspect that is, at the end of the day, what would happen, right, on the long run with the same empire founded by Charlemagne, that is to say, a continuity with the Roman Empire, because you know that in Daniel's prophecy there is all a list fundamentally of various empires, and so in this prophecy, everybody wanted to more or less see what kind of empires that the book referred to, and in many ways the Roman Empire had already been seen like the last. So albeit I made a video about this, from the Imperium Francorum to the Imperium Romanum Christianum. That's the title of the video. The Carolingians were still soaked in the idea that their one was a Frankish empire, right? It was still the Frankish ethnicity put at the core of the imperial superiority over the other peoples, right? Gradually, this thing would tend to overlap with the Romanity of the empire, because the Roman past naturally was that Constantinople was still seen legitimately as the Roman Empire, right? So this made it uncomfortable for the Westerners when it took the task of confronting themselves with it in terms of recognition of the same imperial title from them, which was important from a secular point of view. And it was so because it could, in a sense, provide the Westerners with that superiority of the secular rule over the church that was present in Constantinople and that the West did not exist. But as we have explained, the latter case was actually and probably one of the single greatest lacks of Western civilization, achievements for that matter, as Rome and the papacy kept carrying out this effort from their own side. And the Romanity of the empire was too great of a thing, that is properly the ethnic connection to the Romans as the imperial holders fundamentally chosen by God also for the birth of Christ in their empire, etc., was so huge, was so enormous, that it could not be fully substituted, even though the Germans thought that there was still in Ottonian times, when the official Roman titling was adopted, there was a recalcitrance, because in theory that would have been a Saxon empire, even though that was the point. Already at the time, already in Frankish times, I made a video last spring of the fact that at this point, what we called the Frankish Empire was factually a Franco-Burgundian thing, in terms of properly the centers of power. Like in Ottonian times, it was a Saxon-Franconian thing. And eventually, if it had any ecumenic ambition, an imperial title was, as we will see now, provided by the Roman Pope, with a very specific role that, after all, fit dramatically the unity of the universal tradition, according probably also to pre-Christian times, and I will make a video about this soon at some point, because the understanding of the world was, again, deeply compenetrated by both the Uranian and the Chthonian dimension, right? In a way that had to complement each other and to thus make the magic, of transfiguration happening. The Carolingians ended up to accept the fact, and Alcuin was already aware of this evidently, that the Romanity of the empire was, after all, a very positive thing to attach to the Roman rule, right? Just, in the Frankish homeland, this was probably an irrelevant thing, but in terms of international relations, and also within the same Frankish empire, it was a huge deal. I talked about, those peoples that were within the empire but were not Frankish, to attach this Romanity to power. And just to say that in 9th century, 10th century Britain, we find some ephtarchs, or probably even English kings at that point, styling themselves with the title of Basileus, right? Which is mind-blowing if you realize that what it actually means, because Romanity permeated everything. Like, all Europe knew and beyond that there was a Roman Empire still out there, right? That the empire was not a territorial reality per se, but it was the ecumenic empire per excellence. Rome stuck to universality. There was nothing to do for it to be reversed, right? And it ended, from a formal point of view, in 1806. But look at all world's powers and what their symbolism derives from. It's Roman symbolism everywhere, right? So we are actually still living, right? If people had any awareness of these things, within that, in fact, ecumenic meaning that Rome was. And even though, again, we don't understand even what it means, because nobody teaches us, nor families, nor schools, etc. But it's a very powerful and real thing. And it was kind of obvious at that point that even Alcuin was suggesting the fact that taking over the same papacy in Constantinople would have equated to restore the Romanity of the empire. It was, after all, again, there more than it would be later, right, in terms properly of the existence of a Roman Empire factually and meant and how it was intended properly, even though it was observed that Constantinople had lost ecumenicity, right, and which was an excuse to legitimize, a good reason actually to legitimize the rise of a more powerful ruler that would put an end to that despicable situation, especially when Constantinople was factually a woman ruling that would have killed her own son eventually, and that therefore didn't make any sense in the mindset of the time. And there is more to this, properly what the entire tradition, what also the Germans had maintained together with other Europeans, in the idea of the northern conqueror that subjugates the more female south and restores the Asgard, etc. This is all very very clear, and that this papal exile from Rome, and as well as the imprisoning of Constantine VI in Constantinople, were quite evidently the case. And this is not, of course, to ignore also the overwhelming amount of of connections that had existed between the Frankish kingdom and the Roman papacy ever since the establishment of the former, and that had brought at this point already de facto to the existence of the empire, to the conquest of Italy, to all the privileges relations that existed between Rome and the Frankish rulers, and so on. Without this bond and the ideological meaning of it, there can't be quite a full understanding. Also because Alcuin was writing de facto from, we're not fully sure about his vows or etc., but he speaks from an ecclesiastical perspective, like most authors of his times. But what a Frankish, a rude, killing machine like the average Antrusiones of Charlemagne would have thought, probably had actually much stronger awareness of what the older imperial ecumenic ideal was. It was hyper-loaded and exalted and fanatic and bloodthirsty enough to be wanting to achieve that, and we've seen how the Carolingian armies were pretty damn good at achieving that. So Charlemagne, by the way, was literally obsessed with veterotestamentary monarchy and warfare altogether, unavoidably. So it was all soaked here in this Romano-Germanity, kind of pagan Christianity, and that in many ways were the same thing, as I relentlessly repeat, as you find out just by studying actual history of religions, and for that matter. In any case, what about the causes of the imperial crowning per se, right? Historiography assumes that Pope Leo III sort of acquiesced in creating Charlemagne a Roman emperor in order to restore papal authority in Rome. In other words, he had been exiled from there, so as it would happen in the past, like even Frederick Barbarossa would come to Italy for the same reason the first time. It was always about the tumultuous Roman nobility always having something to say in these affairs, including imperial crowning. And still, in fact, this simple explanation, which is very secularistic in nature, like he just wanted to come to and say, okay, I will name you emperor. Like, why would this have happened in many other instances before? So we don't have time to digress naturally on. We have already hinted, I guess, broadly at the Frankish-papal relations and what the same international situation meant. So this was a good moment, actually, to restore that idea, right? And even though there is much to be said for this argument, that is, the Pope just wanted essentially to come back to the Holy See, it's hard to see why, in fact, the Charlemagne's title of Patricius Romanorum, right, held, as we have seen also by the Carolingian dynasty since 754, so ever since practically the papacy had legitimized the Carolingian succession to the Merovingians, would have not served just as well, right? It was definitely something greater that shows how the papacy and the Carolingians were really looking at something that really meant to take a decided step into the international situation by providing themselves with this new formal authority that was not just the ideal submission of the church to the Byzantine emperor and or other peoples that had nothing to do with the Roman Empire in a legalistic sense. The West, Latin-Germanic Europe, had maintained quite strongly the more archaic and actually original and authentic idea of the connection between power and sacrality, right? In ways that, in many ways, the Byzantines had come to apostatize, sclerotize, just by if it's not an emperor that makes you emperor, you can't be an emperor. But the emperor, if you had asked an archaic Roman, was just he who actually achieved victory on the battlefield, and with essentially a transfiguration that went beyond any title, name, recognition. It was about the actual thing happening by God's will, right? So, because also in ancient times there was actually just one overlord, right? Just like later on. So when we read the sources about the year 800, we may remain surprised by what the sources say. And of course, the Middle Ages are already paradoxically modern and secular enough to draw a kind of more disorderly picture than the unitary view and meaning that was still, however, living within the veins of this, especially of the non-Christian authors that were kind of less careful in saying something that could have brought to dramatic consequences in properly the metaphysical meaning even of imperial power, and so the relations with the church was a very delicate matter. Famously enough, in Heinard's, Charlemagne's biographer's account of 817, the author claimed that Charlemagne was taken aback and was subsequently annoyed to have been proclaimed emperor by a pope. Oh, poor dear, right? As if, Charlemagne had to step in St. Peter and, the Pope said, oh, Charlemagne, look there, where? And, he placed the crown in his hand. Haha, you're an emperor now. I crowned you. Yeah, very spot on, realistic depiction would have. Of course, they had prepared everything. They had already arranged the whole thing. Charlemagne perfectly knew and wanted to become a Roman emperor. And it was a big win for everyone involved. At that point. And the reason why Heinard actually wrote this version is that the only explanation is given that he was also quite, lenient sometimes towards Charlemagne, even in some private issues, etc. Always tried to kind of embellish the picture because he was very devoted to and thankful to Charlemagne for all his, for his protection towards him, for his own. For the munificence that the emperor had blessed him with. So he probably didn't want to stress excessively the fact that, first of all, it's a topos of humility, but that especially he didn't want to stress the subordination of Charlemagne to the papacy, right? Which is in part in line with what the same Alcuin was suggesting. Right here, there was the problem of what does actually have to rule on earth? Is it the papacy or the empire? Because at this point, the papacy was not really the monarchy of the Gregorian reforms with the Dictatus Papit. It was basically declaring that the Pope was the most powerful. Whatever the Pope said, everybody had to obey, emperors included. Right here, at this point, these relations had to be still established, formalized, and also debated, and and in a way, this was still an experimental phase where both the papacy and the empire had their own ideas about each other, but they were to still define formally the political and institutional form in which they would have had interacted with the respective prerogatives and so on. And there was probably from some side the hope that the Western emperor would have become at this point, say, superior to any papal direction, right? So it was intrinsic in this, in the coronation itself. However, this was not the case. It was the Pope that had decided to crown Charlemagne, that also had a great reverence towards the papacy. Absolutely couldn't afford like an iron fist on it. Would have been counterproductive. And still, again, the idea is that there was a Roman Empire there, and that theoretically the Roman Duchy, that was still called like that, was an imperial dominion. So here today we don't talk much about the relations with Constantinople, what the Byzantines actually were doing at that point, because they had also, as you know, supported paradoxically the after centuries of struggles against them, that actually the Lombard resistance against the Franks in southern Italy, where they were sending troops again, and the entire Frankish papal honeymoon had happened in the previous generations under the eyes of powerless Byzantine ambassadors. They fundamentally couldn't intervene in what was they were seeing. That basically Italy was being stripped of their control, or at least of what, in spite of the Longobards, the Byzantines still thought belonged to them, simply by the Franks. They were a much larger power that historically had always loomed on the Mediterranean. Therefore, the Byzantine lake, right? And we have made videos explaining how this crossroad between the Franks, the Longobards, and the Byzantines is like one of the single most important, in fact, in Western history. But how the Merovingian ambitions and also the Justinian's Reconquest ones were all designed to achieve this, from one side to achieve Merovingian control over the former West, but from the Byzantine side also to contain the Franks in just a continental dimension and not making them arrive in the Mediterranean. Now the Franks were basically taking over, they had not just taken over Italy, central northern Italy especially, but also Rome, that for Byzantine emperors had meant a lot also symbolically, even though they had pretty strained, terrible relations with the papacy, but still it was their thing, right? So when we actually look at more important sources, definitely the Annales Regni Francorum and the Liber Pontificalis, so basically the semi-official sources of respectively the Franks and the papacy, we actually read, first of all, simply a much more reliable and objective account, and also as a consequence, the perfect bond between the Franks and the papacy. So what Heinard says, the unfavorable reaction from Charlemagne, it's absolutely not present because it simply never existed, right? The Annales Regni Francorum agree closely with the official Roman account given in the Liber Pontificalis. That is also one of the single most important sources in the history of civilization, right? If you're a medievalist, if you've never read the Liber Pontificalis, do yourself a favor and be a medievalist worth this name. There is, however, another source which is quite curious, that is a Byzantine one by the chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, which is also kind of objective in this sense, but in a kind of sarcastic, passive-aggressive way, exactly because of the aforementioned Byzantine feelings that were, quite hurt at that point. These are all more or less contemporary accounts, right? So the people who had lived in the time. And Theophanes describes the coronation as, of course, a deal between Pope Leo III with Charlemagne. And the motivation, the much more material one that the Byzantine would have stressed, of course, in exchange, that is, for the Pope's restoration to the Holy See. Theophanes writes, in order to repay Charles, Leo crowned him Emperor of the Romans in the Church of the Holy Apostle Peter, anointing him with olive oil from head to foot and clothing him in the imperial regalia and crown. Right, so this is kind of a ridiculous description with, Charlemagne anointed from head to foot with olive oil, and so, yeah, Byzantines can be bitches, and that we all know that. But this doesn't change the fact that Charlemagne was ruling, essentially from the Pyrenees to the Alps, from Brittany to Rome, right? And that's quite a thing that, if it's not an empire, if it doesn't show as a Christian power God's favor and a pretty impressive display of imperium that is also threatening the same Byzantine presence in what remains of its Italian possessions, well, frankly, I don't know what it is. And frankly, as always, it's not a random adverb here. So it's kind of obvious, as we were saying before, that this extraordinary series of events happening between 799 and 800 sparked different memories, right? Opinions on them, interpretations of what had happened, and we don't have to be surprised of the actual thing, right? Charlemagne definitely did appear to abdicate some of his power by accepting a coronation at papal hands, right? But also Leo III was obliged to concede a portion of the papacy's secular claims by elevating a new Roman emperor, right? This part is particularly relevant because by recognizing a strong imperial power in the West, well, it's obvious that the papacy was placing itself under its own control in a way or another. As you know, for the Frankish Italian intervention, the popes had asked essentially for the control of de facto almost all of Italy, right from south of the Adige River to literally the Strait of Messina. That is to say, literally, I mean, the popes at this point, they fundamentally didn't control much more beyond Rome, that, as we've seen, also pretty troubled, but that was a hell of a power anyway. I made a video about the ecclesiastical power in Byzantine Italy as well, and all the fiscal lands were the churches, etc. So really, Rome, Ravenna were powerful lordships, we can even say. But Rome claimed that the popes asked the Franks literally to make them control all of Italy for themselves, like property in temporal terms. Naturally, that never happened, but still, throughout the Middle Ages, the papal states kind of creeped gradually, according to the papal capacities, exactly to recover a great part of these lands that, since Carolingian times, had never quite, the matter of which, since Carolingian times, had never really been solved, right? And that would even arrive almost as far as the northern limits. And that's an interesting perspective. Consider that around this time, the so-called donation of Constantine was in the air, right? The idea that probably the foundation of papal power from a temporal point of view would have been granted by emperors. So thus, bypassing the limit that in theory should have existed between secular and spiritual dominion. And as you know, this was not much even properly a papal creation, but probably a Frankish one. Right? It seems that the original document was, in fact, drafted in France, in the Frankish kingdom, not in the north, if I'm not wrong. And this happened for reasons that we can't digress on. I made a video about that, by the way. But the point being that this document was just accessory in many ways. It was not what would have, in fact, not even become really in how anti-clerical perspective has wanted to stress. I mean, that the popes now wave this thing at every time they want. It was actually the same papal humanists that in the 15th century, namely Lorenzo Valla, debunked the same donation. So that's like all together, the anti-papal stereotypes and hatred and lunacy. It stems from complete ignorance and redrawing, in this sense, of the historical reality. Not much the donation of Constantine being a big deal per se, but definitely those ambitions of the papacy had passed through Saint Church, that even in France, as we've seen here, and in agreement also partly with the emperors, at this point were not brought in the scene, because it was about making the empire altogether, not much the papal dominion just per se. That there was a matter that, as we'll see now, would be handled in a different way. Consider that Frankish power at this point was really at its height, right? So the papacy didn't even have too many means to oppose this creation, even though they were the ones who would accept it. but the Frankish rule over Rome was a fait accompli at this point. In fact, the Saint Theophanes puts it in this terms, quote, "Rome has been under the power of the Franks ever since this coronation." And that had already been the case at that point, telling the truth, from quite a while. Surely it was not under Byzantine rule, because they had tried to bring it under it, and the papacy had also always had some forces and allies to avoid that. So a very interesting opinion about the 800 crowning is actually provided by the Large Annals, the Vienna manuscript especially, because it combines both, say, the Frankish views, let's call them like this, of Alcuin and Einhard, with the Roman interest reflected in the Annales Regni Francorum and the Liber Pontificalis. And it sounds like this, quote, "Since there was no longer an emperor in the country of the Greeks," I love that, because of our Eastern Roman videos, "and the imperial power was in the hands of a woman," that is Irene, mother of Constantine VI, "it seemed to Pope Leo and to all the Holy Fathers who were at that time assembled in council, and also to all other Christian people, that it would be fitting to give the title of emperor to King Charles, who held in his power the city of Rome, where the Caesars were always accustomed to reside." This is interesting too. "And the other cities of Italy, Gaul, and not just those of Germany. Since God Almighty had thus permitted all these places to be placed under his authority, it seemed right to them that, in accordance with the will of God and the request of all Christian people, he should in addition bear the title of emperor. Charlemagne did not wish to oppose this request, and, submitting humbly to God, as well as to the wish expressed by the priests and all Christian people," this is also relevant, "he received his consecration from Pope Leo, and along with it the title of emperor." This is a very intelligent source, frankly. As I was saying, I love how he says, since there was no longer an emperor in the country of the Greeks, right? This is terrifying. But it, again, this does fit, in part, even properly, what the fiction of ecumenic rule had come to, in a sense. And also the fact that the imperial power was in the hands of a woman. Consider that in the Middle Ages there were councils expressed by the church to determine whether women were actual homines, that is to say, the virility attributed to the imperial power and unavoidably connected to it would make it impossible for a woman that was archetypically the symbol of something else, right, of the Chthonic, Dionysian power, etc., to own it. Right, so the church actually was trying to do this in positive terms, because the councils were summoned to say, what about virtuous women, right? Are they actual men? Are they, do they have the human nature in them that was connected just to the virile one? And this was not invented by the church. This is what the entire universal tradition since millennia had actually believed. Right? This may sound terrifying to a contemporary ear, but that's exactly what all people believed back in the day. Right? It was not an opinion of man. This was if you even think in those terms, there is something deeply disturbing in what you think history is. This is what the actual universal tradition was about. That is, the positive power could be only owned by virility. Right? And so the female virtue, especially in sanctity, given the church had to address these things, had to be defined in some way. It was an important theological problem. In any case, a woman could not be an emperor and accepted as such by sacral reasons. Right? And so here the source is very interesting, because it goes on saying basically the Pope and all the Holy Fathers were assembled at the time in council, and also all the other Christian people. So this is a fiction in practice, but perhaps not so far from reality, in the sense that even if there was no real council or ecumenic consensus about this, and because there couldn't be, nobody could organize such inquiry, right, such survey, the overall feeling about the restoration of power, or unitary power, stability, was felt. These were not easy times. The Islamic invasions, for example, were already felt in Mediterranean, in Spain. It was an important moment where also other peoples had manifested an important harassment capacity against the Christians, and so on. So the broader feeling was that providing a ruler with this important ecumenic task was a hope, right, if not a duty of the church, right? They had to mediate this with God. So importantly enough, here the letter acknowledges, first of all, the fact that Charlemagne already owned Rome, right? So where Caesars were always accustomed to reside. So always, this is again the large annals, right? So the idea of the centrality of Rome in the world was crucial, and it couldn't be properly commuted with anything else. So where the Caesar was always accustomed to reside, in other cities of Italy, Gaul, and not just those of Germany, were controlled by Charlemagne, right? So there's also maybe a Frankish, kind of more Germanic view, saying, just Italy and Gaul, say Italy, Gaul too, and not just those the cities of Germany. So, which frankly had much less cities than anywhere, and was not even properly the center of Charlemagne's power, but still, right? So this God Almighty had thus permitted all these places to be placed under Charlemagne's authority. So it was a huge accomplishment. So again, the imperial policy was seen as a positive ecumenic realization, and because of that, in accordance with the will of God, without which there can't be anything happening, and the request of all Christian people. So, in other words, the decisive moral force of the population, Charlemagne should have been titled emperor, right? And Charlemagne here says he did not wish even to oppose this request, right? So it's a myth that he wouldn't want that. He submitted humbly to God, as well as to the wish expressed by the priests and all the Christian people. Again, so the church altogether, and he received his consecration from Pope Leo, and along with it the title of emperor. Naturally, it's obvious that, you see, for how much a Frank would have not liked to think that there was a mediation between divine power and him, still there could have not been any essentially cultural, political, or institutional premise to overstep the church in essentially, in fact, embodying the consensus of Christendom in itself to provide a ruler with such a title, right? So even if probably Charlemagne, again, was not happy to depend, this was a person who had earned his power, okay, by dynastically in a sense, but he had definitely earned it also with his sword and with, extending Frankish power in an unprecedented fashion, and killing and, proving that heroic deeds that, were a bit old the sap of tradition in terms of possible divine transfiguration, etc. But in quite practical terms, those were not enough, evidently, even that he had not transfigured yet, and nobody had quite at that point conceived this idea without also a religious advice of some sort. there was really no reason why to avoid a papal crowning, for how humiliating it would have been in an instinctive sense to be crowned by somebody who had never even taken up a sword and wanted it, so embodying that Chthonian element in a sense that still the mother church was providing this virile power with. But again, it's the mix of the two that was making the fulfillment. You know that even in tradition, the symbol of female symbol and the male symbol intersect it's the six-pointed star, right? And the symbolism is pretty present. The same in the Roman Church. The Saint Charlemagne was obsessed with David. Surprise, surprise, David's star. So there is something there which deeply matched, right, the interests and the wishes and the ambitions and the hopes and the possibilities of these rulers. So, because let's be honest, this was a Neo-Roman Empire as a God-given gift, right? It was the greatest honor ever achievable, right? And ever achieved, fundamentally, in the history of mankind since Roman times onwards. So this is the deeper meaning, in my opinion, of this enormous historical turning point. The ideological implications for the relative status of papal power and imperial authority are set in the way that would have been developed further, right? Both in cooperation and conflict, but still, again, producing great part of that double threat, liberty and conscious loaded, Western defining mindset, that Europe properly developed and exported all over the world. And another important reflection stems from what Charlemagne's role was in relative terms to Constantine and Theodosius, because as an effective protector of the papacy modeled in such Roman emperors, and as also Theophanes perceived, such accommodation between the Franks and the papacy meant the political domination of Italy by the Carolingians. This, again, was already a fait accompli, but not quite ideologically defined and stably affirmed like the Romanity of an empire, right? I made a video also on request explaining whether Rome was or not part of the Holy Roman Empire. This was a vexata question. Technically, the papacy wasn't. But there were some ambiguities regarding this since the beginning, and in international policy, de facto, right? Central northern Italy were ever since under the Holy Roman Empire. Even in the most tenuous, this was a very new thing, you see, because up to that point, the Longobards had ruled as they had properly occupied Italy, and that was their home at that point. And it was they deeply Latinized, and they essentially were an Italian power that had also, in fact, attempted to essentially absorb the papacy and to create something similar maybe to what would have happened with the Franks, but they were just a single people, a single country. The Franks had already an empire, the Carolingians had revived, and nobody from north of the Alps had factually ever dominated Italy up to that point. And so the Frankish conquest at this point was something new that partially also suffered the fact that Rome was so decentralized, and the fact that the papacy always tried to maintain a control on both the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine one, right? Because it didn't stop there. Like the popes in general were kind of not necessarily more inclined, but they still were, thinking at Constantinople up to the 12th century, right? But the entire region, right, from Rome to the Alps, was now secured by the Franks. It was new. It was new because we never really made a video about Carolingian Italy, but it would be very interesting to do because it tells you how they made it. How, again, they always had to essentially to maintain control from a state of just of narrow minority that had to compromise with the local establishment, and that instead is a history of great success with the Carolingians, as we will see now, with Lothar actually providing Italy with the imperial crown and becoming actually the center of the empire, as it would become in Ottonian times, with Otto III even resigning there, because again, the main objective of all these Transalpine rulers was to rule from Rome. Where the hell else would you like to rule a European empire? There's no other possibility. And in fact, Carolingian Italy, and especially the one of Lothar I, Lothar II, is a hell of a Western trade. Just realizing we never talked about that. It's very few people even hear or make videos or know about, because for most it's just the story of the Longobards conquered by the Franks. It ends there. Charlemagne crown, yeah, it's all about the rest. It's actually a very important history, without which objectively you can't even understand most of the Middle Ages. And definitely the Carolingians managing to secure this area and even ruling from Pavia, the old Longobard capital, with the size of support of the Roman nobility, was crucial again to define what probably also later the Holy Roman Empire would be, and the centrality again always of the Italic kingdom, without which there couldn't be an empire by definition, because on the Italic king fell the duty, the task of defending the papacy, and therefore he was the only one who could get the imperial crown. That's the reason why throughout all the Middle Ages, mostly German emperors had to make their Romfahrt up to Rome to get their title, because otherwise it's not that they could proclaim themselves emperors just like that, right? And this reveals, see, there's not that there was a major superpower in terms of, a unitary political entity in Italy that could dictate this. It was just the nature of it. And of course, the enormous power that it altogether, in spite of its political fragmentation, it had as a region, but simply the fact that without that, there couldn't be an empire in the deeper Roman sense that it was, and that the empire was made of. There is a very interesting letter of Charlemagne to Leo III, written in 796, spelling out the king's conception, in fact, of its own power sustaining the Catholic faith. Quote, "It is for us, in accordance with the help of divine goodness, outwardly to defend by force of arms the holy church of Christ in all places from the incursions of pagans and the ravages of infidels, and inwardly to fortify her with our confession of the Catholic faith. It is for you, most holy Father, raising your hands to God with Moses, to aid our armies, to the end that with you as intercessors and with God as guide and giver, our Christian people may in all places have the victory over the enemies of its holy name, and that the name of our Lord Jesus Christ may be renowned throughout all the world." This is one of the most beautiful things, honestly, I've ever read from medieval times. And this expresses powerfully what the point was. That the empire was seen as, was why Charlemagne was obsessed with David, because he thought that Goliath was out there, even though the Carolingians were the real Goliath here. But the idea that there was here pagan incursions and infidels' ravages was actually quite spot on, right? At this point, the Carolingians weren't yet, feeling the brunt of it, as they would when they, because they began to disgregate by themselves. It's not that the second invasions happened, destroying the empire. It was the other way around. The empire self-destroyed itself, and so others could exploit that, but it was nothing, really particularly powerful about it when you consider also how Europe came out of it during the 10th century, but through which the Holy Roman imperial ideology was forged further, right? But the point is exactly this, that Charlemagne will defend the Church of Christ so that he will take care of the sword affairs, whereas the Pope would have to intercede to God, right, in order to make the Christians obtain victory, right? So the Carolingian armies to gain victory over the enemies of the same church, right? So that the name of Jesus Christ could be renowned all over the world, which is also a very powerful idea, almost actually a crusading one, because it entails the fact that the rest of the world has to fear the Christian armies and the name of our Lord. And so this tells you how deeply imbued with that dramatically powerful moral force that had created the same Carolingian Empire altogether, and it was crushing people after another, was felt because of this pride and this mission, right, of ecumenic scale that could not be achieved through the papacy and the Romanity and therefore the divinity of power. It's a beautiful idea of the same repetition of universal powers, right, between the papacy and empire. Now, an important reference must be made to how the Roman coronation was secured over time, because as many things historically, like we know eventually they kept happening, but at the time was not really meant to be, right? When Charlemagne was old, near the end of his reign, in 813, he would have died the following year, he wanted to have his heir, Louis the Pious, to be crowned emperor. His two sons, Charles and Pepin, were dead, and for this reason, this dynastic continuity was crucial also in a political institutional sense. Louis the Pious, just as Charlemagne, had been quite lucky actually that their brothers had died, right, in order to have an empire, because the Carolingians had not understood yet the same problem that had made the Merovingian empire collapse, that is this constant equal split of the same with sons, and this is what would happen with the sons of Louis the Pious, actually, and so the end of the empire itself. And Charles thus wanted Louis the Pious also to be crowned emperor in the palace chapel at Aachen, which some say, well, this is because probably he wanted to move, right, his dependency from the papacy, right? He wanted to have the coronation in the new Rome that Aachen, as probably a city built in stone north of the Alps, was meant to be, was modeled like on Rome herself. Well, this is not correct, right? Historiographically, this has been pointed out already that Charlemagne was perfectly fine with the imperial title being conferred, first of all, to his sons, so already essentially as in the perfect Merovingian, Carolingian tradition, putting in together every possible imaginable form of legitimization for the same dynasty that was considered as partly sacred, properly by blood, which also was a traditional concept, but that had been boosted dramatically just by the Merovingians as properly a dynastic monarchy. And in part, the fact that Louis the Pious had remained an only son facilitated the task, because it was just one person and at that point left for that honor, and his children would have liked to essentially determine would have become emperor formally. And the point is that the Frankish church and aristocracy also were actually agreeing, where there were lots of negotiations about this too, because of course strengthening dynastic power was a big deal for the rest of the aristocracies that, as you know, would make also themselves shipwrecking the whole thing in a couple of generations. But the reason why Charlemagne cared for this crowning is that, first of all, he was already ill. He died of a stroke eventually, but he was too infirm at that point to delay the event in a broader sense. This was pointed out, for example, in the Vita Rudovici. It was a source of the time by Hagen. And it's rather obvious from that situation that the coronation at Aachen rather than at Rome was connected just to this logistical kind of organizational problems, right? He could not go to Rome, right? Given that the emperor was still alive, and so his presence would have been required. In a sense, they preferred to do the thing in Aachen, right? But there is no dissatisfaction with the Roman coronation of 800. Not at all. In fact, the thing would be secured further, as we were just saying. It might have been that the 1813 Louis the Pious crowning kind of made some frank hope that the ether would have somewhat been shifted north of the Alps rather than in Rome, but this did not last long. In 816, Pope Stephen IV recrowned Louis the Pious as emperor at Rheims, which also was of great significance for the Franks, right? But still, the Pope did it, right? So even here you see that they were both compromising in a sense. The Franks were okay with their emperor being crowned by the Pope. The Pope was okay with, going to France to crown the emperor. But especially in 823, Louis' eldest son Lothar, who had been co-opted as emperor as early as 817, right? So 1 year after Louis had been recrowned by the papacy as emperor, was reconsecrated also in Rome by Pope Paschal I. This passage was very important because Lothar had a very good connection with Rome. He had lots of friends in the Roman nobility, and also the Roman people liked him. And so the idea was, also essentially securing his control on Italy on the longer run, as it would happen. As you know, Lothar would have in the partition of the Carolingian Empire with his brothers Italy and Lotharingia, where Western Francia and Eastern Francia would go to his other brothers, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, in fact, in East. And he would rule from the Italic kingdom, which was considered by far the most profitable in terms of properly governmental stability and administrative forms and power and security and closeness to Rome. And so with all the Lombard administrative system still standing fundamentally, the victim practice, the centrality of the cities, and so on. And this would bring, by the way, to the famous Constitutio Romana of 824. So here, again, 1 year after Lothar's properly consecration in the same Rome, which shows, importantly enough, how powerful the Franks really were, also in Rome, right? Because from one side, the papal prerogatives are reaffirmed, but in practice, the Frankish jurisdiction as secular rulers of the same city of Rome was fundamentally accepted as the status, and that was also a very important opening to properly the acceptation of the Germanic, of the Lombard and Frankish rights in the city, which had never been precluded, as far as I know, but they up to the Frankish conquest Rome had remained rather dominated by Roman law still, which meant that Rome was incorporated in the broader empire juridical system, because basically the empire accepted that you could have any kind of juridical identity, right? If you were a Lombard, you had the right to be judged as a Lombard according to Lombard law, even in an imperial tribunal, right? Or if you were a Lombard, but you wanted to be judged by your own choice as through the Salian law, you could. This was already actually present in the same Lombard juridical tradition. But the point is of the Constitutio Romana, albeit showing that the papal subjects were to swear allegiance, were forced to the same pope, so recognizing a temporal power of the same church, right, which was surely accepted by the Carolingians. The Carolingians still maintained through the Constitutio the prerogative, first of all, sending their own ambassadors to the papal election, through which the emperors had to express a placet on such election. That is to say, if the Franks didn't like the pope that was elected, they were, say, allowed essentially to interfere with the election in some way. It was not defined in the Constitutio, so it would remain kind of an ambiguous article, but still showing how the Franks could essentially impose this condition formally, theoretically, in an agreement with the papacy at the time. So over time, as you know, Carolingian rule in all the post-Carolingian, that's what I meant, in all the various Carolingian kingdoms would collapse in a way. So what we see after with the investiture controversy, etc., is just a product of also at some point, even properly an interregnum, the problems that the later Germanic emperors had just to mount up expeditions to come up to Rome, etc. And so the papacy always enjoyed its own autonomous position from which they could, just through their own international spiritual prestige, gather an immense amount of power and wealth in actual, political direction of Western affairs that, ecclesiastically speaking, was already a fait accompli. Also, thanks to the Frankish support that had escorted, protected the evangelic missions. We made videos about that. We will keep making them. We also talked about it in the video about the Kingdom of Frisia, etc. So it was already, again, a European system on the move, on the march, if you want. European system expanding further, consolidating further, and having this essentially Latin-Germanic axis that was, at this point, the real reaffirmation of an imperial power, right? In a sense, it had remained a bit last because Spain was conquered by the Moors. Great part of Central Europe still had to be properly conquered and evangelized. The Anglo-Saxons were cooperative. There was an important, in fact, historical communion with Rome, and the general relations also with the Frankish powers would remain a positive one, right? The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been fundamentally, especially the ones of the southern Britain, surely Merovingian clients. Later on, the Viking problem was a common threat, and as we've seen, just Alcuin, like this prominent cultural figures at the Carolingian court, manifest the important ties that existed between that area of Europe with the continent. But in many ways, what we look at also in with Gaul, with Italy, with Germany, is pretty much the core of, I think, what we can still see today as a form of continuity of the same Carolingian Europe, which is not it's not kind of immediately clear if you look at the continuity of events, but in broader spirit and also in imperial ambition and in the truly, in fact, universal traditional meaning of Europe, these areas do have in common something that goes by far beyond any possible national feeling. It's the meaning of the empire that, of course, the majority of people, of course, everywhere in the world, not even in these countries, know practically nothing about, because simply, again, nobody teaches them this concept properly. If you go to school, to university, nobody tells them to you, right? They tell them, but exfoliated of the meaning of it, so that you learn of these kings, strange things, crowns, names, but you don't understand the logic behind that. If you don't understand the logic behind it, it means that it's useless that you even study them. And I will keep insisting on this aspect, and so far I've done several videos about properly the Renovatio Imperii. I also created a playlist about it, because, again, I think that today more than ever, it's a necessity that must be considered and appreciated for what it truly means. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.